course I've taught for the past 10 years. And Caroline Waldron teaches 20th century American history here, and we decided that both of us have had Barry in our classes before on an individual basis. We decided we would try to do this in a combined way, so hopefully we've got enough members of both classes. People who are in my class, by the way, are supposed to be signing up on the attendance sheet. If you're not in my class, you don't have to sign, okay? Just to make sure we're clear on that. Barry Romo is one of the 4 national coordinators of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. He's from Chicago currently, originally from California. He'll probably give you much more on his background. I've known Barry for about 12 years, 13 years. We've been in the same organization since 1970, but we didn't really know each other until the late 80s. And he is also one of the a union officer with a mail handlers union, works out of O'Hare Airport Postal Service. He's come to speak, as I said, with the Vietnam class and 20th century history classes here quite regularly. And he's going to basically give you an introductory rap for a while, kind of the rap that he gives in colleges and high schools up in the Chicago area. A lot of places he speaks up in the Chicago area. And then we'll open it up for discussion. So pay attention and make notes and be ready to ask some questions after he gets us going. Okay, Barry Romo.
I always tell people, and I'll tell the new people, don't ever applaud unless you know what I'm going to say. Now, some of you know what I'm going to say, so it's obviously all right. You may not enjoy what I say, you may not like it, and if you do, applaud at the end, but you may want to wait and see. The other thing is, please don't ask questions until I get to a question and answer period. Just write it down, let me keep talking. It's easier for me, and that way it may get answered as I keep going through things. For those of you that have been here before, it's the same thing I say. I've said for the last 30 years, my experiences don't change, so you'll probably just hear them again. I would like to start off by asking a little participation, although this is a gigantic class. I don't care. I want all of you, except people that have done this before, we'll just pass you over. Clear your minds. I'm now going to say the word Vietnam. I want you to think about that word, and then I want you to tell me what is the first thing that comes to your mind.
Massacre.
Vietcong.
My father. Army. Television. The state.
You're not participating?
Military. Dancing. For sure.
It's all right. You can say the same thing. What? Civilian children?
Horrible. Colonialism. Jungle. Lie. Jungle. Jungle. Ho Chi Minh.
Platoon. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Loss.
Casualties?
My uncle.
Your uncle.
Glass splits.
Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
War.
Lisa.
Death.
Back here. Yeah.
War. Jungle.
What'd you say? Soldiers. You just flunked. The Vietnamese always tell me to tell Americans that Vietnam is not a war, but is a people. And when looking at Vietnam, one of the first things that we do is see it through our perspective. And to us it was a war, and to them it's their home and their country. The group I belong to, that Joe belongs to, is a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And you should always know where people are coming from. The group I belong to is the oldest Vietnam veterans group. We were formed in 1967. We're the largest Vietnam veterans group. 50,000 people marched since 1967 or filled out application forms with VVAW. We were the first group to bring up the question of post-traumatic delayed stress, which is a psychological problem with Vietnam vets, in 1970. And when we brought it up, the traditional veterans groups, the American Legion, the VFW, the right-wingers, the Republicans, and the pro-war people said that we were just sissies. And other people had gone to war and don't bring up this question of psychological problems. 9 years later, the federal government recognized PTSD as a service-connected disability. We are the first group to bring up Agent Orange, a defoliant with a dioxin base, which causes birth defects in women and cancers and problems in men exposed to it. In 1971, we protested its use in Vietnam. At the time, we didn't know that it was poisoning vets. We only knew that in some areas of Vietnam, that huge sections of the population were giving birth to grossly birth-defected children. That eventually was also, 15 years later, seen as a service-connected disability, but not until more than 20,000 veterans died. All the while the war in Vietnam was going on, all the while the bombs were dropping, all the while people were dying, being wounded and killed, no Vietnam Vets organization protested to keep the war going. The only group was Vietnam Veterans Against the War, people who fought against the war that we fought in. 2/3 of the people in VVAW were combat, despite the fact that only 10% of servicemen themselves are combat veterans. 3/4 of us enlisted. We weren't drafted, we volunteered. So we had a way out of proportion number of people that volunteered and an out of proportion number of people who were Marines, infantry, special forces, and other such troops. The overwhelming majority were conservative, not liberal when they went in the service. So we were the true believers, people who enlisted, who went in the military, not to do something bad, but because we thought we would do something good. And I guess that leads me to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from a Mexican-American family on my father's side. My ancestors go back to 1834 in California. They go back before that to New Mexico. And so we were in that area of northern Mexico for several hundred years before the drybacks came. My parents, my great-great-grandparents were in California when it was taken over by the United States. My father's generation was the first generation that spoke English. My grandparents never spoke English, they spoke Spanish. My father was born in 1899. My family was mostly agricultural workers. They would work on farms selling themselves out, or they would pick fruit and lemons, oranges, which were big in Southern California. My father went to school, and in first grade couldn't speak English. It was against the law until 1968 to speak Spanish on schoolyards in California, despite the fact that when the United States took northern Mexico from Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that they were to respect culture, which meant religions and Catholic schools, and language. It even meant that the California Constitution all the way up to the 60s, I don't know after Ronald Reagan, had to be written in Spanish and English in order to abide by the treaty. But before 1968, if you spoke Spanish in the schoolyard, it was against the law. My father went to school, he spoke Spanish, he would be beat. The teachers would make him wear dresses. He learned to speak English. He quit school when he was about 10 or 11, went to work in the fields, picked fruit. Then he got himself a job in a slaughterhouse as a butcher, slaughtering. Then he got a job as a meat cutter, joined the Meat Cutters Union in the 1920s, belonged to the union for over 50 years. He went through strikes and the Depression. Didn't get drafted to World War I. Got married, had his first family, 2 kids. And in the Second World War, my father, at the age of 44, got drafted. My brother was already in the military. He was a ranger. He had joined the California National Guard, and he had been activated. And my brother, at the age of 20, went off to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. My father, at the age of 44, went off to Europe to fight the Nazis. Now that's good for me because my mom was a British war bride, and if he hadn't gone, they wouldn't have been here. But I'd like to point out the fact that while John Wayne couldn't make it off the black lot, while Ronald Reagan would memorize an eye chart so that he would be able to become an officer, he always claimed his eyes were bad, and so he couldn't go to combat like he wanted to. But his eyes were also so bad that he couldn't become an officer. So what did he do? He memorized the eye chart. And he passed the eye chart enough to become an officer, but not enough to be sent to combat. What? This guy couldn't memorize one more line to make it into combat? So while John Wayne and Ronald Reagan stayed in California, my father went off to Europe. My mom comes from an Irish-English family. Her grandmother and mother were born in Ireland. They were actually going to come to the United States. Were on the docks in Ireland, ready to escape, and my grandfather died. And so my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother was afraid to travel all the way, so she cashed in the tickets, and instead of going to New York, they went the short way to Liverpool. My family worked in the docks, they worked in steel mills, my British side. My mom was an strict Irish Catholic, including Catholic school from Liverpool in, of course, that Anglican country. My parents met, fell in love. My dad lied about how old he was. He was 20 years older than my mom. And my mom, like a real pioneer, left everything behind and moved to California. I was raised in a Mexican-American family with no English relatives, but knowing who I was, mostly because my mom had no prejudice. And while my father would say we were Spanish, she would always laugh and say, there ain't too many Castilians picking fruit. And of course she said it with an English accent, which I can't do. And she always made me proud of the half of me that was Mexican, to the point that she even made like Mexican-style English food, bizarre as that is. I was born in 1947. My father was 48 years old. My father never hit me once. Not once. Said big men don't hit babies and little people. But if he hollered at me, that was enough. My mom beat the shit out of me, but she was only 5 foot tall and weighed 100 pounds. And I was raised in a Catholic school, strict Catholic, the strictest of Catholics. Can you imagine Mexicans and Irish Catholics in England? You talk about isolated. The parish I grew up in was about 1/3 black, 1/3 Mexican, 1/3 white. A place called St. Anthony. I was raised not to be a racist, to respect other people. In 1954, our neighborhood in California was blockbusted. People now probably don't know what that was, but during a time of segregation, real estate people, to make money and playing upon racist fears of white people, would buy some homes, move Afro-Americans in, and then go door to door saying your property values are going to go down because they moved in. Our whole neighborhood in a year turned from white to black. My dad said, I don't care. Humans are humans. All I care about is that my neighbors are good. And so my parents raised me with a sense that people were human. And my religion at that time gave me a sense of universality. I did think about people in other countries as human beings. I thought about other people in other places as having souls, and hopefully the correct religion so they didn't have to go to hell with those souls if they weren't baptized. I had 12 years of Catholic school. The last 4 years were all Catholic, all boy, St. Thomas Aquinas. I wrestled in high school. I liked it. I was real small, and if any of you wrestle and don't eat food in high school, you know you don't grow. Sophomore year, I wrestled, I think, 98 pounds, and then my junior year was 103. My senior year, I think it was 112, and then when I went to college for just this amount of time, just enough to go in the military, I think I wrestled 118. I was like 5'2", went in the military, and in 1 year, I went from 118 pounds to 145 and grew 5 inches that first year. So I guess there's something to be said for eating when you're in high school. I was raised in a culture of the most intense anti-communism. I saw things going on in the South, and a lot of times would think that they were being perpetrated by the commies. When I saw Afro-Americans beat in the South, I would think it's got to be the commies that are stirring this up. Now, I didn't think I knew that they had a just cause. I knew that Martin Luther King was right. I knew that Bull Connor was a pig, but I also was raised with an ideology, and we all were, that came out of McCarthyism, where all the problems in the world were because of the international communist conspiracy. And while I was growing up and going to Catholic school, the good Catholics, especially under the leadership of people like Cardinal Spellman and a number of other delightful human beings, pushed books about a place called Indochina that we had to read in high school. And they were by a guy named Dr. Tom Dooley. Dr. Tom Dooley had been a Navy doctor, and he had ministered people in Vietnam and Laos. And he got out of the military, and he became a Maryknoll missionary, and he would go to the back countries, and he wrote these 3 books that were mandatory reading called Fire from the Mountain, a whole bunch of things, but there was 3. And in them, they had examples of how the Kurdi communists were killing my Catholic brethren in Indochina. And one of the things that it said was that the communists would go into a village and they would take the Catholic priest and they would cut his tongue out. And they would say, "You will never teach the Hail Mary again." And then they would go to the children and they would put chopsticks in their ears and they'd say, "You'll never hear the Hail Mary again." And that was the kind of stuff that we were raised on. Catholics dying in Indochina, we have to go there. Now, only later did I learn that Dr. Tom Dooley was paid by the CIA, that the books were paid by the CIA. Did some commie pinko besmirch this guy? No. The University of Notre Dame had to do what is called a thing for beatification. And so the university was given the job of checking his background, like you always do, because they wanted to make him a saint. And when the University of Notre Dame checked to find out whether he should be made a saint, they had to say, "We can't do it," because the guy was a CIA agent. So one of the people that led me to Vietnam was a person that was lying to the world about what was going on there, and was paid for by a department in the government that wasn't allowed to have any influence by law internal to the United States. But there are laws and there are laws. My brother came back from World War II in the Pacific, got married just like my father did. My nephew, Bob, was born 1 month after me in 1947. We were raised like brother, seeing as my real brother was 27 years older than me and my nephew was 1 month younger. It gives you an idea of who I wanted to hang out with. I had 6 nephews and nieces that were 10 years to 1 month younger than me. In 1965, I decided to go in the military. I decided to go for the same reasons that a lot of people do. My parents couldn't afford to send me to college, and the GI Bill looked attractive. I was working in a grocery store, Safeway, as a box boy, and that didn't look that attractive. There was a war, and if you're a man, you go off and you fight. And so I enlisted in the Army with 2 other people I'd gone through high school with at St. Thomas Aquinas. We enlisted on the buddy system. And when I went to enlist, my father was 66 years old, sat me on his lap, and cried and asked me not to go. And I said, "Why, Dad?" I said, "You went off to fight in the Second World War." And he said, "Son, that was to go off and fight people that were putting people in ovens. You ain't going to be doing nothing but going off and fighting people who are farmers who just want to protect their farms." And he cried and told me not to go and not to go and die there. But of course, my dad, his first language was Spanish. He only had a 6th grade education. What did he know about the world? I was sure I was going to tell him. And I enlisted in the service in January of 1966. And I went in the service, and I thought, like a lot of young men, that the service was going to be colorblind, that everybody that was in the military was going to be green. And by that I mean the uniform that you wore. I thought that we were all going to be brothers and comrades like you saw in the movies, especially those nice World War II movies where they had one black, one Cuban who could fight, mostly Desi Arnaz. They had an older white sergeant who was everybody's old sarge. They had an officer that cared. And all those movies that helped mold me and mold what war looked like. But I went in the service and I discovered something. The stuff that exists in American society, the racism, the chauvinism, the misogyny, exists in the military, and it's amplified even more. I went in thinking that all my comrades, no matter what their color, were going to be my equal, that we would die for each other. But the myth of military equality soon vanished. One of the first things when we were in basic training, about 300 of us, 18 and 19-year-olds, shaved heads, sitting in a set of bleachers, being taught how to fire a rifle. And the drill instructor looked in the crowd, saw an Asian American, I don't know whether he was Japanese or Chinese, but he had slant eyes. And that rifle instructor said, "Do you see that goop? That's the same thing you're going to be fighting in Vietnam." Now, it didn't matter to that rifle instructor that that gook was an American in an American uniform, that that gook could be dying in Vietnam. The only thing that mattered to that rifle instructor was the color of that man's skin and the shape of that man's eyes. How do you produce killers? How do you take people who for 18 and 19 years of their lives have been taught thou shalt not kill? You get in a fight in a bar, they arrest you. But now, not only do they want you to kill, they give you medals for it. They promote you for it. And you're not killing because you're defending your family. You're killing because the powers that be have made a political decision on who your enemies are. Basic training and military training is a lot like what would happen if you were in a cult. They shave all your head off to take away your individuality. They don't call you by your first name. I've been called Romo. That's the legacy of being in the military. My last name is my first and my last name for 33 years. They shave your head, look alike, sound like the Moonies? Yeah. They get you up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They make you run. They make you chant. They make you wish that you were something decent. And they tell you that you're good based upon how well you take orders, not how well you think, and how well you separate yourself from society as a whole. First thing they do is they use racism, which is endemic in American society, so that the people that you kill are not human beings. That's why the people we fought in Vietnam were gooks, slopes, slant eyes. They weren't human beings. That's why the people we killed in the Persian Gulf War were towelheads, camel jockeys, sand niggers. You have to dehumanize the enemy. Secondly is the question of manhood. The majority of the people that do the killing, overwhelmingly, are testosterone-filled males. Males who are trying to prove themselves. And so what you do is you define the male in opposition to the female. All of our chants were about women, your sister, your girlfriend, your mother, who are sleeping with guys at home, who aren't trustworthy. And if the military wanted you to have a wife, they would issue you one. If you can't run and carry your pack and make your bed so that you can bounce a quarter, you're a sissy, a pussy, a cunt. And they define you in opposition to race, and they define you in opposition to women. And it hasn't changed that much. Can't say it is bad, but the same things run through infantry training. After basic training, I went to AIT at Fort Ord, California. I took a whole bunch of tests. I passed them, flying colors, and on my 19th birthday, I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, July 24th, 1966, where I began officer candidate school. So I was sent to Fort Benning to become an officer, a commissioned officer. And the reason was that the military was going from being 25,000 in Vietnam to 45,000 to 145,000 to 300,000 to 500,000. And so even though I was only 19 years old, I was going to be a lieutenant. At the time in the United States, we were being told to go to fight in Vietnam for freedom and democracy. When I got to Georgia, the guy running for governor and the guy who won governor was a guy named Axe Handle Lester Maddox. We were being told to go fight for freedom and democracy in Vietnam, while Afro-Americans who were veterans were being shot down in the streets of America for asking for the right to vote. Medgar Evers, World War II vet. Most of the NAACP voter registration organizers, Second World War Korean vets, shot down because they wanted communism, because they wanted to vote. And so blacks in the military were facing an incredible contradiction. And those of us that were trying to sort out what was the real America, what was the real military, and what was the myth, were starting to face those contradictions. Not because some actress named Jane Fonda said the war was wrong. Not because some college professor told us the war was wrong, but because we could see in the military, if you were not racist, what was guiding this country. 1966, while I was at Fort Ord, California, 3 African-American National Guard majors from Maryland taken out of their car, shot and murdered for being uppity niggers, murderers, local police force, were found innocent. Field grade officers in the military could be killed because they were African American. I finished my training. I was sent to Fort Ord, California, where I was the officer in charge of an escape and evasion range. So I would train people how to survive, and 2 or 3 times a week, we would kill snakes with our bare hands, we would kill rabbits with our bare hands, we'd kill chickens with our bare hands, and we would clean them with our bare hands, because you can do all that stuff. The snakes we always cheated, but we didn't let the trainees know. But you would kill them in front of them, and you would gut them, and show them how to cook and how to eat them, and you'd let them eat some snake, and you'd let them eat some chicken, and you'd let them eat some stuff, and then you would have an escape and evasion range, and you would tell them that this is what was going to happen to them if they got caught. And you would take about 20 people, and they would get the shit kicked out of them, the trainees, and then you'd say, we're going to let you go, and you're going to have 8 hours or 10 hours, I can't remember now because I'm getting senile, and they would drop them off at a truck, and they would have to run through that section of the fort. And then I would have other trainees that had already gone through, and their job was to catch them. And if they caught them, they got to kick the shit out of them. If they didn't catch them, then they did a good job. But what you got out of it most was that if you got captured by the enemy, they're going to torture you. And if you capture them, you're going to torture them to get the information so that you can stay alive. I was the officer in charge for 4 months. I was sent to Vietnam in July of 1967. I was made an infantry platoon leader in the 196 Light Infantry Brigade, unit specially developed for Vietnam. I actually wanted to go there. I didn't want to go to the Delta. Real short. And the thought of running around in Delta rice paddy water up to my chest didn't appeal to me. And I heard that in I-Corps, which is the area next to the DMZ, they had lots of mountains. I'm from Southern California. Mountains sounded much better to me than lots of leeches and water. The only thing was is they never told me that they had land leeches in Vietnam as well as water leeches, and so it didn't matter where you were. If you were in the jungles, the leeches ate you, and if you're in the water, the leeches ate you. So I was sent to the 196, where I was given a platoon. And for the next 6 months, I had anywhere from 18 to 45 men underneath me. I was one of the youngest men in the platoon, but I was the officer in charge. People saluted me. People called me sir. I was 19 and then turned 20. I could drink, and I had sergeants who were 45 and World War II vets. They couldn't drink because you drank by rank. I could have beer and hard alcohol. They could have beer, but their rank wouldn't allow them to have hard alcohol. Now, believe me, they could find it, but institutionally, that's what went on. The real case, or the real reality of combat in Vietnam came to me within 2 weeks. I realized that the war wasn't quite right. And again, it wasn't because of what Jane Fonda was said. It had to do with the kind of war that we were fighting. I mean, first off, what you got to understand is you watch movies about war, and what they tell you, or what they show you, is somebody gets in a giant fight, people are killed, like in Hamburger Hill, the beginning of it, and the next thing you know, they're sitting in a brothel drinking beer, talking about how it's too bad, or how bad vets get treated when they come back from Vietnam. War wasn't something that was fought on an 8-hour basis or 5 days a week. When we went on combat missions, search and destroy missions, they would last 34 to 45 days. You didn't get weekends off. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. 7 weeks, 24 hours a day. You'd get up in the morning at first light, You would mix yourself some coffee. Strange, 80 degrees, but you're making coffee. People would smoke a cigarette. You put your backpack on, which would weigh anywhere from 110 to 125 pounds. Why? Because you had to carry enough food and ammunition and explosives for 3 to 4 days at a time. You had to carry enough that if you were ambushed, that you could fight back without having to be resupplied. And so you carried 3, 4, 5 times the normal load of rifle ammunition. Everybody carried machine gun ammunition. Everybody carried C4 explosives. You carried regular hand grenades, fragmentation. You carried smoke grenades so that if you called in helicopter support, you could show where you were without getting blown up. You carried white phosphorus grenades so that you could blow up tunnels or set them on fire. You carried radio batteries. You carried water. Even in triple canopy water, jungle, you would carry water. Why? Because it couldn't mean you could find it. Didn't care if it was dirty. I drank patty water when I was in rice paddies. Didn't care. Wasn't afraid of feces. I was afraid of bullets. So you carry food. That was before they had a dry, all in cans. Carry your cigarettes, carry your letter writing material, and it's all in your backpack. 4 to 5 days at a time. And I can tell you, after I was in an engagement once where we ran out of bullets. You think you felt so at something you did. Try being in the edge of a rice paddy and people don't have any more bullets. And you're wondering whether they're going to come across or whether they're going to leave you alone. So after that, I made my men carry more ammunition. But quite frankly, all the squad leaders and all the people who went through that experience made sure that everybody else carried weapons too. So you put 110, 125 pounds on your back. And it's now 6 o'clock in the morning. And you'd start to walk. You didn't talk when you went out on patrol because you had to hear what was going on. And you didn't wear sunglasses. And you didn't listen to the radio. Sometimes you talked. But mostly you listened. And you walked, and you walked, and you walked, and you listened. And you waited. You walked, and you walked. Hundreds of meters, kilometers. And you walk, and you wait, and you walk. And then it'd get to be noon, and it's 120 degrees. You stop, you make some coffee. You eat some food out of a can. You crack some jokes. You're set up in a perimeter position, so you're in a circle. Hour passes, you put your backpack back on. You get in a file formation, one right after the other. You put machine guns out to the side. And you walk, and you walk, and you wait. And you walk, and you wait. And then it gets to be evening, and you stop, make some coffee, eat some sea rations, wait an hour. Starts to get dusk. You divide your unit up. If I had 24 men, I had to have 3 ambush patrols. My unit would break up into 3 different groups. We would go to the bend of a river. We would go to the edge of a village. Because in Vietnam, from 6 to 6 was curfew. And anybody that moved out of the villages in free fire zones could be killed. You weren't allowed to move in your own country. I hear people say, we didn't win the war in Vietnam. We had one hand tied behind our backs. I was never not in a free fire zone. Now these guys may have been serving in the center of Saigon, where they weren't allowed to kill some general's daughter. But every area I was a free fire zone. That meant if people moved between 6 at night and 6 in the morning, or if they ran from us, we could kill them. Everyone we killed was a body count. no matter what age they were. And then about dusk, we would break up. We would go out to our different areas. 50% of the people staying awake at all times. 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Couldn't eat, couldn't talk. If you smoked a cigarette, you had to dig a hole, put a poncho over it, stick your head underneath it. Because if the light from the cigarette was the show, Viet Cong would kick your ass. Stay awake for 2 hours, go to sleep for 2 hours, stay awake for 2 hours, go to sleep for 2 hours. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. You get up, make yourself some coffee, put your backpack on, it weighs 110 to 125 pounds. 6 o'clock in the morning, and you walk, and you wait, and you walk, and you wait to be attacked. Because in Vietnam, 90% of all combat was initiated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. 90% of the time, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong ambushed us. Shouldn't surprise us. They lived there for 2,000 years. That was their country. We were there for a year. They were there for millenniums. I never ambushed a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese unit. Not once. Yes, I was ambushed many times. And you would wait because 90% of the time they shot you first. Even though we had all the tanks, we had all the guns, we had all the ships, we had all the planes. 90% of the time, they ambushed us. 1/3 of all the casualties in Vietnam were from mines. $16,000 Americans died from stepping on mines. The most common mine in Vietnam was a mine called the Bouncing Betty. People who were near their class saw this. Bouncing Betty was an American mine. Americans developed it during the Korean War. It was the #1 mine that the Viet Cong used. But wait, they're the Viet Communists. That's right. Bouncing Betty was a U-shaped mine. At one end was a canister about the size of a can, a soup can. And inside of it, nestled snugly at the base, was a small mine about the size of a tennis ball. Underneath the mine was a small charge. You would take this and you would bury it. So these little fingers coming off a pencil-like structure on the other end would stick above the ground. As the GI's big foot would come along, they would step on one of these, and this American mine would have an electrical charge that would go. It would set off this first explosion. That explosion would blow the mine into the air, and then it would explode. And the way that the Americans developed the mine, the way the scientists developed the mine, was that it flew into your crotch area and into your lower stomach. So it blew your gonads off, and it blew your stomach out. Now they could have made the mine blow all the way up to the chest and kill you. They could have made it so that the mine blew up and hit you in the face and killed you. They could have made it so that it blew up to your knees and crippled you. But they purposely made a mine that would blow your gonads off. Why the sheer terror? 19-year-old testosterone males, most of whom are virgins, don't fear death. They fear having their nuts blown off. But the commies didn't invent it. We did. The commies just bought it from our allies in the Saigon government. They stole them. The areas I were in, that was the most common mine. 16,000 American killed just on mine. So then we'd get lunch, have a cup of coffee, and we'd walk, and we'd wait, and we'd walk, and we'd wait, and someone would step on a mine, and their legs would be blown off. You'd call in a helicopter, and a helicopter would come in. They'd put the person on, and they'd fly him away. And 90% of the time, they would live, because we controlled the air so much in Vietnam that they could get a medevac helicopter to you quicker than you could if you were on the expressway. They talk about Vietnam being a small war. It's not a small war in total casualties. There was almost as many Marine casualties in Vietnam as World War II. What there wasn't was the deaths. People would have parts of their bodies blown off and live, whereas what they would die from in the Korean and Second World War, people were living. 500 Americans lost both arms and both legs and lived. They'd fly your best friend away. You didn't go to a rear area. You didn't get drunk. You put your backpack on, and you'd start walking and walking and waiting to be hit again. And then it became 6 o'clock. And you did that for 35 to 45 days at a time. It didn't matter how many casualties you took. You still had to keep going until that operation was over. And if I started out an operation with 45 people, which happened, and 3 days later I was down to 25, I still had to do everything that I had to do with 45, with 25. And so you had people never getting a full night's sleep, walking day in and day out, waiting to be attacked 90% of the time, waiting to step on a mine in somebody else's country. When I went to Vietnam, I had pictures of myself being like my dad in the Second World War, that I'd be going to Catholic villages. The old people would come out and throw flowers at me. When we went through villages, they looked up, but mostly they looked down. They didn't look at you in the face. They didn't tell you what was going on. And if you got mortared in your night position the night before, they didn't tell you where the Viet Cong was that mortared you. If you stepped on a mine, they didn't tell you who pushed the mine there. And they didn't come out and tell us, be careful of that area or be careful of this area. The people supported the guerrillas. After 2 weeks, the war didn't seem like or make a whole lot of sense to me. I wasn't gung-ho. I never ran away. I was never a coward. In fact, I didn't think I was going to get wounded. I was never afraid of being wounded. I thought I was going to die. I had a good Catholic fatalist thing. I was in charge. I was going to die. I was going to get as many men home alive as I could until that time happened. If they told me to go out to an area, like they would do, if they didn't fly me there, I might not go. We used to call that search and avoid. See, in the movies they talk about search and destroy missions. And we did that. But we also did search and avoid. So I'd have 18 men left, and they'd say, we want you to go 4 clicks over here, because we've heard that there's 10,000 communists, and we want you to go over and check it out. And I'd say, yes, sir. And I wouldn't go over. I'd walk half the way there. I would sit down. I'd let my men take a break. I'd let them shave. I'd let them write home. Because believe it or not, in Vietnam, they didn't give you time to write home. You had to do all this other stupid shit. People would write. People would shave. I would lie and say that I was over there. Then I would lie and turn around and say I was coming back. Does that mean I didn't get into battles? No, because remember what I told you? 90% of the time, the Viet Cong initiated combat. It just meant I wasn't going to walk 18 men into 10,000 Viet Cong so that then They could call in artillery to wipe out the 10,000 men. We used to call it Judas Go. The military came up with this brilliant plan. We'll take small units and we'll walk them into areas where we think there's a lot of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. Then the North Vietnamese will see this little few number of men, they'll attack it. When they attack it, they have to give away their position. So while these 1,000 people are running you down like you're Custer, then they're going to bring in gunships and airplanes and get a real big body count. And that makes them feel good because, see, if that could happen, and I had 6 men wounded and 2 men killed, but they blew up 100 people, why the body count looks real good because it's US 2, Viet Cong 100 did. War became a goddamn sport in which we determined whether we were winning based upon statistics. Westmoreland said, we just have to reach that point that we can kill more of them than they can produce. And so it's all right in the process of killing them that you get killed. Not because you're going to take a beach. You watch Saving Private Ryan. Private Ryan's running on the shore. Private Ryan wants to take the beach. Private Ryan is successful if Private Ryan takes the beach. They didn't say to Private Ryan, okay, get down off the beach, kill as many Germans as you can. Whether you make it on top, it doesn't matter. We'll just add up how many Nazis are killed and how many Americans, and that's who wins. There was an end to it. In Vietnam, there was no end to it. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was death. Victory was determined on the number of people you killed. And the pressure for body count was such that if a colonel wanted to become a general, if a captain wanted to become a major, if a lieutenant wanted to become a captain, you got good body count. And the U.S. military turned us in to bounty hunters in order to up body count. You out on patrol, the person in the battalion, that's about 800 people, who kills the most people, gets an in-country R&R to China Beach. So now you've got 800 people who are in the jungle, who are being shot at, who are stepping on mines, who can't get sleep, and who are being told that if they kill the most people that month, they're going to be taken out for a week, sent to China Beach, prostitutes, drugs, alcohol, and maybe living, because maybe you'll be out before you get overrun. And it wasn't the number of people that you neutralized. It was only the number of people that you killed. Example, you're going out. We're on patrol. You kill 3 people. 3 Viet Cong. Got their guns, everything else. You've now got 3. You go out. You capture 26. 27, I like the number. Capture 27 Viet Cong. You capture all of their weapons. They can be interrogated. 27 Viet Cong cannot now kill us. Who gets the pass? The one who killed 3 people. How many times do you take prisoners? How do you get out alive in a war in another country? War became body count, and that's not what I went there for. Question of killing. I knew I was going to have to do, but it wasn't supposed to be that way. I went there thinking I was going to fight for freedom and democracy, and you soon learn that it wasn't freedom and democracy we were there for any more than it was freedom and democracy in Alabama or in Georgia. If we killed people in a village, everybody we killed was a Viet Cong, no matter what age they were, if we blew the village up on purpose. What do I mean by that? We're walking down the road. You got a village of 100 people. You're one Viet Cong in a village of 100 people. One person with a rifle, and you shoot at us. And we call in an artillery barrage, and we blow the village up. We kill 17. Only really one Viet Cong. The other people are civilian. When it gets written down, all the dead are Viet Cong. Now, if we killed somebody by accident, then we'd actually pay them money. I did this for a while, called Battalion S5. It's a salarium plan. If you kill them by accident, it's very strange, right? So even though there's only one person that's firing at me over here, and we blow you up and 17 people die, you're now all Viet Cong. But let's say that I'm walking down the road, and you shoot at me, and I call in an airstrike. But the guy in that Phantom jet just can't read a map. And so he flies over, but instead of hitting your village, he hits his village. Now we made a mistake. Americans would go in and pay him money for killing him by mistake. If you killed a kid, you'd pay him $60. I mean, yeah, $60. If you killed the mother, you would pay him $90. If you killed a father of 4, you pay him $120. Only if it was a mistake. Now you may say this is Vietnam in 1967. There's a war going on. Vietnam's the poorest country in the world. $120 considering it's a war. Well, that's better than nothing. Let me tell you another story. That is, while I was in Vietnam, I was allowed to blow up any place I wanted to blow up. Well, not any place. If we were walking down a road and you were shooting at me, but instead of shooting at me from a village with 100 people, you shot at me from a Michelin rubber plantation, we couldn't shoot back. The sap in the trees was more important than our blood. Well, we would shoot back, of course. We're stupid, but we aren't that stupid. So then we would destroy some of your trees. They would go in and pay Mr. Michelin $600 for every tree that's destroyed. Now here you are putting your life on the line. Here you are fighting for freedom and democracy. Here are you killing people and watching your friends die, and you discover that the sap of a Michelin tree is worth 10 times the blood of a child. And you start to see what you're fighting about. All of a sudden you discover that all of your allies in the Saigon military are a bunch of gangsters, pimps, drug pushers, black marketeers. They don't fight. And you discover that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, the hated commies, your enemies, were the best soldiers in the world. They'd fight, and when they ran out of bullets, they'd start throwing rocks. So it couldn't have been race because the Viet Cong fought and the Saigon, our allies, didn't. One of my jobs when I was a battalion S2 at a later point was to read a map and go out with ARVN units. I wasn't an advisor. All I did was take a map and I called it back to battalion and brigade headquarters to say where that Saigon troops were. You know why? Because when a battle happened, if they called for help from the Saigon units, a lot of times the Saigon commanders would say, oh yes, we're coming to your aid, but all they did was lean forward in their foxhole because they were chicken shits. And so a whole bunch of Americans would die because our stooges weren't willing to fight, which also says something that proves they aren't that dumb. And so my job would be just to read a map and tell the headquarters where our allies were, not advise them, but just keep track of them. After I was in the field for a period of time, I became a battalion S2, which is an intelligence officer. I also became a battalion S5, as I said, at pay salarium payments. One of the other things that we would do is we would pay the local civilian population to bring in unexploded artillery rounds and bombs. The United States, during the course of the Vietnam War, dropped more bombs fired more artillery than all the sides of the Second World War. Think about that. The United States, in a 10-year war, dropped more bombs than every single side in the Second World War. Japanese, Russian, Americans, Italians, Germans, French, British, Brazilian, more bombs on a country the size of California. 7 to 11% of all the explosives that we used in Vietnam didn't explode. They were what is called duds. What is a dud? A dud is a round or a bomb that has a detonator inside it. If the detonator doesn't go off, the thing doesn't explode. What the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese would do, now think about this, here's a B-52 dropping 1,000 bombs. 7 to 11% of those bombs are not exploding. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese would go out, take those 500-pound bombs, drag them into tunnels, saw them in half, and make mines, explosives, hand grenades to blow Americans up. 7 to 11% didn't explode. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, 99% of the stuff that they used, they produced in Vietnam, South Vietnam itself. All it took to resupply the entire North Vietnamese military and the Viet Cong infrastructure a day was 66 deuce-and-a-half trucks. That's all it had to make it. Everything else they could buy, like the mines, or they could make. And what we would do, because so many rounds did not explode, is we would pay civilians $1 to bring in unexploded rounds. And a lot of Vietnamese who didn't want to sell drugs, a lot of Vietnamese that wouldn't be prostitutes, a lot of Vietnamese who were living in relocation camps and forced out of their home would put their bodies on the line to bring in high explosives to make money to eat rather than do any of the other lucrative things that they could do and serve America. I had a helicopter every day at the age of 20 as a first lieutenant, fly around, see where I was supposed to. How long have I been talking? Okay. To see where we were supposed to set up ambushes. I became the guy I hated when I was an infantry platoon leader. I was stuck in battalion as a 20-year-old high school graduate with all ring knockers, which means West Point graduates, the majors, the S4s, the S1s. We used to call it the West Point Protective Association. No matter how bad you were, if you were from West Point, you got promoted and you got protected. So here I am, a 20-year-old who loved rock and roll, stuck with a whole bunch of old farts. But one of my jobs was to fly around and be like them. They never understood why I didn't like them. And on one day, there was an explosion at a side of the base camp where we were, at a place called Tam Key in the northernmost section of Vietnam. And we were told that there were civilian casualties and that I should take my helicopter over there to fly people to the hospital. What had happened was 3 to 4 Vietnamese civilian children were bringing back a 105 howitzer white phosphorus round. White phosphorus was developed in the Second World War to burn down Japanese villages. It's something that's combustible in the air. You can't put it out with water. You're taught that if it lands on you, you don't put it under the sink. You turn your hand over and you let it burn out the same hole that it's in, because otherwise the chemical reaction and the gravity will mean that it'll burn its way through. A lot of times when you see James Bond movies and they're destroying things, that's white phosphorus that they're putting on top of their secret files to burn through their file cases. Actually, we use those on the radios as well. Well, there was a 105 round, which is a cannon with a round that big. The white phosphorus round didn't explode. They were carrying it back to the base camp, and they jiggled it. Something hit. It exploded. 2 or 3 of the children disappeared and simply didn't exist anymore. One little girl, somewhere between the ages of 10 and 14, was burned from the neck down. She had a beautiful face. I don't know how old she was, but she was beautiful. And she was burned, and she was bleeding. I wrapped her in my poncho, which is like a rain slick, rubber rain slick. I put her in the helicopter to fly to a military naval hospital at Chu Lai. I wrapped her in the poncho so she wouldn't stick to the bottom of the helicopter because of her burns and her bleeding. She moaned like a little kitten. She was in shock. We flew to Chu Lai. I jumped out of the helicopter with her in my arms. I ran to a doctor, and unlike MASH, he took one look at her, and he said, "We don't treat civilians here. You have to take her to a Catholic missionary hospital." Didn't matter to her or to that doctor that Vietnamese was bringing back unexploded rounds that was saving Americans' lives. It didn't matter that we were supposedly in Vietnam for the freedom and democracy and future of Vietnamese children like this. The only thing that mattered to that doctor was that she had slant eyes and her skin was a little different. I put her in the helicopter. We flew to Tam Key to give her to the nuns. As we were going there, shock started to wear off. She started to scream and throw herself around. I had to hold her in the helicopter on the floor because you never have doors, and the doors are never opened in combat, and she could have thrown herself out. I don't know whether she lived or whether she died. But I know that her life was worth more than $60 or $600 of a tree. But that's what we were there doing. I couldn't take being in the rear area. I kept asking to be sent to the field. In December, we had a number of units wiped out in my unit, and they wouldn't send me to the field. My battalion commander, a colonel, said that he didn't want my blood on his hands. And then a new group came into country called the 11th Infantry Brigade. The 196 was incorporating itself with the Americal Division. This was 1968. And in the 11th Brigade, most of the people had no combat experience. So they took a whole bunch of people from the 196th, officers like myself and senior NCOs who had combat experience, and they called it infusion. They sent us down to the 11th, and then they took a bunch of people, our same rank, sent them back to the 196th. That way they had some people with combat experience in this new unit that was in country. We went to Chu Lai, me and a number of other officers who were my friends, including this guy named Lieutenant Fox, who was a really great guy who had spent 8 months in the field, and they'd sent him to the rear area. He'd went to an officers club and made a play for the girlfriend of the brigade colonel, and so the next day he was being sent back to the field for trying to pick up the colonel's girlfriend. Again, it didn't matter that he'd already spent his time in country. We got exceedingly drunk, and after 2 days of drinking, we were given a briefing along with all the other officers and senior NCOs about what the area was like we were going to. It's called G2, a full bird colonel in intelligence, Americal Division. And they sat us all down and they started to brag about what a great unit we were going to. And they told us that in fact, just that day, or over the last day, 24 hours, that an American unit with the 11th, with a group called Task Force Baker, had got casualties of 400, 500 Viet Cong, hardcore Viet Cong, and that this was a real rip-snorting unit. All of us sobered up like that. Why? Because when we counted 500 bodies in the 196, there was 500 American casualties. They took their bodies with them. I don't mean there was 500 dead, I mean that there was 500 wounded and dead. And so we got a little scared and we got a lot sober. One of us asked, how many American casualties? He said one, a machine gunner who shot himself in the foot. So we're thinking 400 to 500 body count, one American self-inflicted. One of us asked, how many weapons did they capture? The colonel said, 3. 3 weapons could have been 2 hand grenades and a pistol, a hand grenade, a mine, 2 pistols. So we're thinking 400 to 500 casualties, one American who shot himself, 3 weapons. And one of us said, they're killing civilians, aren't they? The colonel ended the briefing and sent us to an area around My Lai and a place called Pinksville by American troops. Everybody who heard about the body count in Task Force Baker with Lieutenant Calley knew they were killing civilians. You couldn't possibly kill 500 enemy and not have a casualty. You couldn't possibly kill 500 soldiers and have 3 weapons. People knew, but people didn't talk about it. After the story started to get out, a major who had been an S3 with the 11th was transferred to Division S3, and a guy named Major Colin Powell had to do the initial investigation of the My Lai massacre. He said he found no credible evidence of the killing of civilians at My Lai. If he wanted to see, just had to open his eyes. After being with the 11th Infantry Brigade for a couple of months, I was told to, where I was an infantry platoon leader again. I was doing the same thing I did with the 196th. I was told to go to a clearing and be helicoptered out of the area where we were in. I only had about 45 days left in the country. I thought maybe I was going to a rear area job for my last month in country, which was very common for officers. Forgot to tell you, in the meantime, my nephew, Bob, who was born 1 month after me, was drafted in the military. He had flunked the military test twice, the mental test. He had flunked 2 grades in grammar school. And they drafted him anyway under something called Project 100,000. People talk about the fact of a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Never was it more true than in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there was approximately, I'm just going to do this for numbers' sake, because my mind isn't working right now. I can't remember whether it's 16 or 18 million. So I'll tell you 16 mil to be conservative, but I think it's 18 mil. There were 16 million young Americans who were eligible and of the right age to be drafted into the military. That was the pool that the country had of young men. All the branches of the service put together, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Marine Corps, needed 6 million men. All that was needed for Vietnam was 2.7 million men. 10 million more than you need. And of that, even only half of those go to Vietnam. And yet, what did they come up with to make rich man's war, poor man's fight more real? Well, a guy named Senator Moynihan and Lyndon Johnson came up with something called Project 100,000, in which they would draft 100,000 kids a year who couldn't pass the mental and sometimes physical exams because they said it would give them a head start in life, because the military would be good for them for discipline and good for them for education. And so while there was no shortage of manpower, they were drafting the first year 63,000, and by 1972, 134,000 young men a year who couldn't read, who couldn't write, who couldn't speak English. They had one thing in common. They didn't have any political clout. I had people in my platoon from Appalachia who couldn't read and write. I had people from Mississippi who couldn't read and write. We had to write letters home to them. While they were being sent to Vietnam, like my nephew, people like Rush Limbaugh was being given a deferment because he had a pimple on his butt. Phil Graham from Texas, going to school on a national defense loan to become an economics professor. And I'm sorry if there are any econs guys in here. National defense, econ, I'm sorry. So he gets a national defense loan, something that was supposed to be set up so that we would get scientists to defeat Sputnik. But listen, fuck Sputnik. If we got young Republicans we can keep out of the military, give them a national defense loan. Gets a student deferment, stays in college, never goes. Not a single fucking Republican leader went. Georgie Bush, little Georgie Bush. Combat pilot, Texas National Guard. Someone had to stay home and protect Texas from Louisiana. Dan Quayle. All these right-wing motherfuckers who today want to talk about people who are in the anti-war movement did not have the physical, the moral, or the political courage of their convictions. And I want to emphasize physical courage as well as moral and political. How dare them stand up any place and talk about the anti-war movement. These fucking cowards who, when it was their age, when it was their time, allowed 100,000 guys a year to take their place. Now, it wasn't just them. Not one of the Daley brothers went. They're all my age. I joined Young Americans for Freedom when I was in high school. That was proof I blew my brains out. Not one single person went into the military in my chapter except me. They went on to demonstrate against the demonstrators, but they never had the guts to go. 100,000 kids a year who couldn't read and write, drafted. Come to think of it, Dick Daley flunked the law exam 3 times. He should have been in Project 100,000. Nobody in the right wing goes. They attack the left wing. Not a single person with the courage of their convictions. You say, what about Senator McCain? Senator McCain is a third-generation military career officer. Senator McCain went to Annapolis. Senator McCain was supposed to go to war. That was his career. He became a politician later. They attacked Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton came from a broken family of alcoholics. Mommy and Daddy didn't pay his way to be a Rhodes Scholar. He clawed that by himself. Now, I do want to admit that that was the high point in his life, and that every time since then has been steadily downhill. Till now, he thinks, probably, like Ronald Reagan thought, maybe that he was in the war. I tell people, best times of his life, when he was in college. Got out of college, fuck. My nephew got drafted, and like 50% of the people who were drafted in Project 100,000, he became a casualty. In May, in the post-Tet offensive at a place called Dong Ha, he was shot in the throat. He drowned in his own blood. When I got to the helicopter, a major held a sign up to me. He didn't even say it to me verbally. It said, your nephew, Bob, was killed. Your brother has been requesting that you be a body escort. Will you do it? got on the helicopter. I wanted to die. I started thinking about extending in Vietnam. I got flown to the base camp, to be flown to another base camp. I met the other people who I'd been infused down to the 11th Brigade with. I told them that I was going to extend. I was going to go home, bury my nephew, and then come back to Vietnam. And they said, no, you aren't. They said, if you try to extend, we're going to break your fingers. And I knew they would, because they've been killing people. Breaking my fingers wouldn't be shit. And they said, once you get home and have a beer, have a chocolate shake, and have a hamburger, and get the dust off you, you'll realize that you're not supposed to be here. I had a death wish at that point. I was afraid to come home. I didn't think I could fit in. I felt guilty. My nephew got drafted and killed. I was supposed to die, not my nephew. My nephew was such a likable guy that when they drafted him, every enlisted man in the company he was in signed a letter to the commanding general to say, do not let this guy stay in combat, he'll get killed. They didn't ask that they not go to combat. They said he was too sweet a guy. I was back in the States 24 hours later with my nephew's body, landing in Northern California. People talk about being spit on by the anti-war movement. I got off the plane and I had clothes that were about 10 months old from a duffel bag in the heat and jungle of Vietnam. Think about what they smelled like. I'd been in the jungles, hadn't washed yet, had been put on a great big army jet with jet engines on the inside. Wasn't a passenger jet because they had to get me back as quick as possible. I went and got a taxi to go get a hotel, and the taxi driver took me to, I can't remember how many motels or hotels. I mean, it felt like 100. And every time I went there, even when there was a sign that said vacancy, they took a look at me. Still had Vietnam dirt on me. Stank like an infantryman. And every place said no. My taxi driver felt so bad for me after a while. He turned the thing off and wouldn't accept payment, and just kept driving around till he found a place for me to stay. The anti-war movement didn't spit on me. It was the people running the hotels that didn't want dirty teenagers staying at their place. I buried my nephew. I was then reassigned to Fort Ord, California, because I only had 45 days left in Vietnam. I became a company commander at the age of 20. I had 350 men underneath me. I ran rotation cycles where I trained 300 men at a time, 99 and 9/10 of them to go to Vietnam. It was a special advanced infantry company training at 2nd Brigade at Fort Ord, California. All the people from 2nd Brigade all went to Vietnam. And I tried to convince myself that by being a good officer and by passing on the stuff I'd learned, that I would help them stay alive, but I was really just lying to myself. I was a good Catholic. I was teaching confraternity of Christian doctrine. 20-year-old teaching Bible school to other Catholic officers' kids. And I lost my faith. One day I was sitting in church, Fort Ord, and I looked and there was a stained glass window in the back of the military chapel. And it had, I can't remember now whether it was Christ the Good Shepherd or one of those. And here he's up there, and I'm looking at the sheep, and I'm looking at Christ our Lord, and I'm thinking about the men I killed, and I'm thinking about the people that died underneath me, and I'm thinking about the chaplains in the military who don't ask for peace but pray for war. And when people asked to become conscientious objectors, told them no. And I stood up and I walked out and I went back to my bachelor officer's quarters. I became physically ill. I vomited and I didn't go to church again. Well, I did, but that's another long story. Only once. And I got out of the service. Someone helped me get into college. I couldn't talk about the war. If I tried to talk about the war, I cried. I felt dirty. People didn't make me feel dirty. I felt dirty. I got involved in the civil rights movement, support for the Black Panther Party, and trying to free people called the Soledad Brothers, and I got involved in civil rights, but I couldn't do anything about the war. I couldn't talk about the war, and people asked me about the war, and I'd cry. And I heard Country Joe McDonald's song, Fixin' to Die Rag, which I live dearly now, and I broke out into tears. I couldn't deal with it. Peace movement didn't spit on me. They did something an awful lot worse. They talked to me. My friends asked me what the war was like and whether it was worth it. They didn't allow me to give them platitudes. They engaged me in conversation. They listened to what I had to say. They were non-judgmental, but they were guiding. They made me face that what we were doing in Vietnam was wrong, but what I had seen and done was wrong. They didn't make me feel dirty about it. They made me feel responsible for doing something about it. So I became politically active, turned in my Bronze Star that I won in Vietnam, and joined the peace movement. We weren't spit on. We were in the leadership of the peace movement. By the time I was 25 years old, I was a national coordinator helping to organize demonstrations of 1 million people. Vietnam vets weren't estranged from the peace movement. We were from that generation. I keep telling people, you can't imagine what it was like to have USO shows with people like Bob Hope and Les Brown and his band Renown. I wasn't a fucking World War II vet. I didn't like Lawrence Welk. I wanted to hear Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Al Green and the Temptations. I wanted to hear real music and rock and roll, and I wanted to grow my hair long, and I wanted to smoke and take as much dope as I could. I didn't smoke dope in Vietnam. I was a lieutenant. I couldn't wait to put the largest amount of drugs in my body available once I got out of the service, because I couldn't sleep at night, because I couldn't face my dreams. I went to school full-time. I worked in a full-time job washing trucks out in the middle of the desert, and I was in the movement, and I took more drugs than Jimi Hendrix. Just didn't take the same kind. If you would have told me that horse shit would have got me high, I would have went in a field and stuck a whole bunch of manure up my nose. I didn't want to remember what I did, and I didn't ever want to be in a position of leadership again. I'm alive because I became involved in politics. After the Vietnam War, 130,000 Vietnam veterans have committed suicide. Twice as many Vietnam vets have blown their own brains out as died in combat. This is known deaths. This isn't people that have killed themselves on drugs and alcohol. This isn't people that are buried away in prisons. This isn't people that are in single car accidents and motorcycle things. These are confirmed suicides. We didn't kill ourselves because some 19-year-old hippie without a bra in a peasant dress spit on us in San Francisco airport. One, we all wanted to date that 19-year-old. Two, if that's the worst thing that ever happened to me, a 19-year-old spitting on me, my life would have been a pretty easy affair. It was the experiences of Vietnam, not of a homecoming, which produced the suicides. And what Vietnam Vets Against the War gave me and tens of thousands of other people was a focus in our life to turn the pain and the hatred that we'd inflicted on other people to good use. Politics is therapy, yeah. 1972, I went to North Vietnam, and I'm going to end there, and then you can ask me any question about any subject you want. Want to ask me about killing people? You can't. Maybe the only chance you get. Want to ask me which drugs I like most? Yeah. 1972, I went to North Vietnam with a person named Joan Baez and who I'm sure you all know, another person named Telford Taylor, who was Assistant Dean of Theology at Yale, and a guy named Telford Taylor. Telford Taylor was a brigadier general in the Second World War. He was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. He's an internationally known scholar on war crimes. So he's a brigadier general, an anti-war commie vet, a pacifist singer, and the Reverend. Exactly like a World War II movie. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon had announced the peace was at hand. They had stopped the bombing in October. There was supposed to be peace. We were taking packages, Christmas packages, to 535 American POWs. We got to North Vietnam, and as we were driving into the city, we had to stop because the road was about the size of that table, and you couldn't have people going both ways. And the bridge was under the water. It's true. I was there. The bridge was that far under the water so that when the planes flew overhead, they couldn't see it. And they had another bridge down over here that was above the water. And when the planes would come in, they'd blow that bridge up. But that bridge was always getting blown up. This one over here that was that far under the water that you really traveled on never got blown up once. Damn Vietnamese. And while we were waiting, we stopped at a real small village, or it's really called a hamlet. A village in Vietnam is like a county. A hamlet is that little place with a few houses around it where people live. And we stopped at a hamlet, and there was a preschool there. And all the little kids came out, and I don't know a fucking thing that they said, but you sure do know when people welcome you, and especially when they're little kids with a teacher. You know, the teacher came out all smiles, and the little kids went, ah, na, 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 na. I don't know what they were saying, but you knew. They were laughing. They were having a good time. They got to come out and meet the really strange-looking Americans. And we all felt good. And Telford, being the brigadier general that he was, looked at the village and then looked right next door to the village, and there was a railroad yard. And the railroad yard had been totally and completely destroyed, and it was right next to this village that hadn't been bombed. And Telford said to me, precision bombing. Blow up the railroad yard, don't hurt the village. Okay, Telford. We waited a while, went to Hanoi, settled down to a hotel, and 2 days later, Richard Nixon, just like Hirohito and Tojo in the Second World War, started a sneak attack against North Vietnam, and in the middle of the night started an assault on North Vietnam, in which, in the area I was in, there was 150 B-52s a day dropping bombs, equivalent of 1.5 nuclear weapons a day in the Hanoi area, every day. Richard Nixon said that he wouldn't bomb at Christmas. I have a tape with him bombing at Christmas during midnight mass. And day in and day out, we would walk to areas that had been flattened. We would see people digging with their bare hands, trying to get their relatives out alive. We visited Bach Mai Hospital, the largest hospital in Indochina, built by the French in 1936. 900 beds on every single map, bombed 3 times. Not only bombed, but they also dropped delayed bombs, so that when the doctors and the nurses were digging with their hands and with shovels and spoons to get patients that were buried alive out, those bombs would blow up. You know, in North Carolina, we're trying to chase down this nut who blows up abortion clinics. And we say he's a terrorist. You know why we say he's a terrorist? Because he set a bomb at one place, and it blew up the clinic, and he sent a bomb across the street so that when the police and the firemen came, it would blow them up. And the FBI and everybody says, you know what? That guy's a terrorist. He tried to blow up the rescue people. Richard Nixon did that 1,000 times over. And the people never took it out on us. We would walk the streets. They would try to talk to us, sometimes speaking German, because that was the only foreign word they knew. And every day the Vietnamese would get us drunk. was another reason to get drunk. But they would take us, and they were the most amazing people. And coming from a Mexican-Irish background, I know how to drink. My family drinks. Come on. Poles are up there too, but they ain't that good. Irish and Catholic wakes, Irish and Catholic weddings, what's the difference? Vietnamese would have rice whiskey and rice wine. They'd have beer that was 10% alcohol and barely any fizz. They would have orange liqueurs. They'd have they'd have Russian vodkas, and they'd have Chinese, I think it's called Mai Tai.
Well, it's Mount Tai.
Mount Tai, right, which is kick-ass. And they'd start at one end, and the name of the cigarettes they smoked was called Dien Bien Phu, right? Great victory over the French. And they had on one side a tractor, and on the other side they had a guy with a flag waving victory. And these things would make a Camel non-filter seem like a Virginia Slim. And they'd start smoking and start drinking, and we ate well compared to the population, but really it wasn't what you would say five-star stuff. And we would drink, and we would talk, and after a while, I couldn't go down into the shelters because B-52s are incredible. When they bomb, they actually call it Rolling Thunder, was the first operation, and it's exactly like that. I'd been in areas in South Vietnam, but not this close, and they would drop, and they would actually churn the ground up, and if you were underground, you could feel it, like an earthquake, like a train. And I figured I'd rather die above ground, and so the Vietnamese said I had to go to the base, go to the bomb shelter, then I could go back up. And so I would constantly go back up, and I would count and watch the planes getting shot down, because they shot down 15 B-52s. By the way, they were drinking with us one day, and they said, you know what, Curtis LeMay says that he's going to bomb us back into the Stone Age. But you know what? Vietnamese say, we're going to shoot B-52s down till we're in the aluminum age. 15 B-52s. They bombed a POW compound. They bombed the French embassy and killed the French charge d'affaires. They bombed the Cuban embassy. Day in and day out. One of the times we tried to leave, we went back next to that little village that I told you about with the little children, next to the railroad yard that had already been destroyed. The village was totally wiped out. Nobody was left. Not a brick on a brick, not a stick on a stone. Everybody was dead. And I was an asshole. I said to Telford Taylor, precision bombing. We couldn't leave, and we were brought back to Hanoi. The Vietnamese threw another party for us, and they scraped together an egg and an orange and some flour, and they made us from scratch a cake. And some high-ranking officials that we weren't supposed to know came to drink and eat and have a piece of cake. And I'm sitting there drinking, and I start to cry. And I totally and completely break down. I'm seeing tens of thousands of Vietnamese die. My nephew died in Vietnam. I killed 6 people. My men died. I'm in North Vietnam. All the mixed feelings that you can possibly have. And the Vietnamese ran over, and they surrounded me like 10 mother hens surrounding a chick. They took me away from all the rest of the Americans, over to a side, and they started to soothe and talk to me and be my friend. And they said, Barry, the problem is you're taking all the pain and guilt of Vietnam and you're trying to put it on your shoulders. It's not your fault. They said your government took your precious idealism and used it to try to kill us. But that doesn't matter now. The only thing that matters is that you stand for peace today. And they said you're working off the basis of hate and guilt, that these are destructive emotions, that you have to work off the base of love. Love of the American people, they're peace-loving, good, and love of the Vietnamese people. I didn't thoroughly know what they were saying. Of course, I was crying and crazed, but I knew a little bit. And they finally said, Barry, one day this war will be over, and you'll enjoy the Vietnamese peace more than everyone else. Because you'll know the horror of war in the South. You know the horror of the bombing in the North. And so you'll know real peace. Fucking commies. Took me back. Finished getting drunk. I came home. Had 2 New Year's Eve parties. And continued doing anti-war and political work. Any questions? Look, I got 2 hours sleep. I worked last night. I work at the post office. I'm dangerous. You can't bring me here and not ask me questions. Yes, sir.
This may sound like a stupid question,
No.
but the Vietnamese we were talking about, those were North Vietnamese?
Those were North Vietnamese. 2 of them were members of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. One of them was a person who lost every single thing that they owned while we were there, Mr. Quat. Another one lost his family while we were there.
How's the military dealing with women now that they can't, when women are running with them, they can't call them times to do that?
They find their ways around it, and I was just talking to, actually I was just, what school was I at? I was just at, junior college. I was at Elgin, and I was speaking to a class, and one of the women in the class kept nodding her head at everything I said, and she had just got out of the military after 6 years, and she said, it's all the same. It's just they use different words and they find different ways to express it. Women aren't in infantry units. Infantry units are still all male. Is it going to have to change? Uh-huh. The same way that there had to be a change around Afro-Americans once you had Afro-Americans in the officer corps. It's not changed yet. Would I trust 100,000 estrogen teenage women as opposed to 100,000 testosterone men in combat? Goddamn straights I would. I was a decent human being at least to 30. Told my daughter, doesn't get to go out with boys until she's 30. I'm serious about the language. I mean, those things around sand nigger, towel head, camel jockey, I got all of that from Persian Gulf vets. That's not something I made up. That's something that was said.
Did you ever return to Vietnam after the war?
Yeah, I went back in 1987. It was a tremendous catharsis to see the country at peace. I went back with a whole bunch of other Vietnam vets.
What was your impression?
Extremely, extremely poor country. A country that's extremely proud. A country that has manners. Now, your country like the United States, and they don't know how to treat their families with manners, let alone foreigners. If the Vietnamese didn't like you, you know what? They just walked away. If they wanted to talk to you, they talked to you.
So how was the general?
General thing was they liked us. They had like a Marxian viewpoint, which said the masses of American people are really cool, and it's the ruling class that's bad, and we have a lot in common with all the common people. And they say that the 2 reasons that the United States lost in Vietnam was, 1, the Vietnamese won the war on the battlefield, and number 2 was that the peace movement tied the hands of what the U.S. government could do. Richard Nixon, in his book, says that one of the reasons he didn't use nuclear weapon was because he was afraid of the reaction of the peace movement. If we didn't do anything else except stop Richard Nixon from using nuclear weapons, that anti-war movement was worth it. But we did a lot more than that. This country has changed. This isn't the country of the 1960s. It has a long fucking way to go. And normally when people get to be my age and become old farts, they start saying, came a long way, what do you slow down? No, got a long more way to go, but it isn't the same place. Black people are winning offices in Mississippi, not being shot down. We have a long, long way to go as things like Rodney King and I'm really bad on names right now, but the murder of the African in New York City, 41 bullets for 19 hits because the guy opened the door to his own apartment building. Obviously a danger. We still have political prisoners like Muammar and other people. But it is a different and a changed country. And the movies and the media want you to think that nothing changed. They want you to think that you can't do anything. They want you to think that you're selfish. They want you to think that you can't know what's going on. The one thing we did have was a feeling that we could change the world. I wasn't that good of an organizer. I'd go on a student campus, I'd tell some of the younger organizers with 50 leaflets, and we get 500 demonstrators. And now you pass out 500 leaflets, and you're lucky to get 50 demonstrators. But people thought that they could change, and people felt outraged around things, and people exercised their rights.
What are your feelings on the situation in Kosovo?
Well, it's a very bad situation for me because for 30 years I've opposed American military actions. Because I think the U.S. government is an imperialist government, because I think that the U.S. government does not have the best interest of people at heart, because I watched the United States slaughter people in Nicaragua and El Salvador, because I watched the U.S. government train torturers for Nicaragua, because I've met people who have been tortured in the Philippines. But I support NATO in Kosovo. It's not easy trying to think. When I was young and I would watch TV and black people would get beat on TV, and George Wallace would say, we're not really beating them, it's the news media. It's the people that hate the South. I knew what I was watching was wrong. When I came home and people like Kim Fook, a little girl who got bombed in a famous napalm picture, she had skin falling off of her body, and she became a worldwide symbol of peace. And when they showed her picture and her running, General Westmoreland said, don't pay attention to that. It's the media. The media has their own prejudices, but I know what I see with my own eyes. When Rodney King got beat by the police told me, don't look at that beating. You didn't know what he did before. You don't know what he's going to do after. We thought he was on crack. I don't give a fuck what they said. I saw what they did. I don't need someone to interpret that for me. When I see 500,000 people jammed on the roads like it's fucking World War II, and Nazis are on the march, as bad as I feel, as much as I hate military people, generals, not lieutenants like me, as much as I despise Clinton, pig motherfucker that he is that bad enough for you? It's irrelevant to the pain and the suffering that the people of Kosovo are going through. And it's not something that happened yesterday. I've been working around peace around the former Yugoslavia for 11 years. I've never worked with Albanians. I've worked with Jews, Serbians, Croatians, Slovenians, Bosnian Muslims. 10 years ago, they took every right away from Kosovo Albanians. 10% of the population told 90% that they had no rights. You know what? When a guy named Smith in Rhodesia said that the 10% that was white should have all the rights and the 90% shouldn't, VVAW took up, not arms, but took up collections to get fatigues for black guerrillas to fight that supremacist government. If I see the same thing going on there that I've opposed in other places, do I base myself upon what the U.S. government is doing or the pain and the suffering of the people who are there? If I was in charge, I'd be doing a whole lot better job of it. But I have to ask, what would you say to the peasant woman whose daughter's been raped, whose son's been killed, and doesn't know if she's ever going home again? And it didn't start yesterday. They've been doing this for 2 years. I worked around Bosnia. I provided bodyguard defense for counselors of rape victims from Bosnia. 30,000 women raped, 5,000 women raped and forced to have their babies. Kept in concentration camps till the third trimester, so they had to give birth to Serb babies. The reason that rape is an international war crime now is a reaction by the entire world and the women's organizations of almost every country except the Serb countries, from Bangladesh to the Philippines, is because of the reaction of what the Serb fascists did in Bosnia. 2.5 years ago, they got a peace agreement. Did the United States pour in millions of dollars to support B-52 or B-92 and other progressive forces, other forces fighting democracy? No, because the United States does what it always does. It kisses the butt of every strong man there is around because they're afraid of democracy. Whether it's George Bush, whether it's Clinton, whether it's Ronald Reagan, and quite frankly, when it was Jimmy Carter when he was in office. Maybe a good ex-president, he was a bad president. And so now, I support it. I don't feel good about it. I don't feel righteous about it. But you got to. I'm an activist. I'm not going to go out and demonstrate for it. I'm going to tell the news media what I think. I'm going to tell people that are my friends what I think. And I'm not going to organize anything against it. What do I think should happen? I think anybody has the right to defend themselves. I think the KLA has the right to defend themselves. And for 10 years, we haven't allowed them to have weapons. 7.5 years, we didn't allow the Bosnians to have weapons. What kind of madness is this? We find an insane gangster like Milosevic, and we say, you get to have all the guns, you get to do all the slaughtering, and we're going to tell the other people they can't fight back. I don't know if that answers your question.
I have a question about changes in tactics, the lessons of Vietnam for the policy takers. Looking back on the Gulf War, the use of this, like particularly the sanctions, which are slower, which are more silent, which are less of a television type, something they can show people or will show people. How do you feel like the lessons that were learned, how, like as far as how to destroy a country, how do you feel like they have been applied since? And what are those lessons?
I could be wrong on this, but my feeling is that the United States, especially its intelligence and military sections, and summed up the Chile coup and decided that they did it wrong. And that what they should have done was starved it out more ahead of time rather than cut it off in a coup, while a lot of people still had faith at that time that socialism and that some kind of democratic socialism could exist. And it was at that time that they started changing tactics and developing better tactics in terms of choking countries off. I think they learned a whole bunch of stuff. One of their other tactics was they used to kill the leaders of mass movements in South America and the Philippines. In the 80s, they changed, and they started killing the secretaries and the office staff personnel. Why? Because people don't care about secretaries, because they don't have a big name. But who's the most important person in your office? Who's the person that knows everything? They started taking lower level people, and people didn't become agitated. You go out and you kill the head of a political party. Everyone goes, what the fuck did you do? Look at Allende. You kill the secretary, and it doesn't stay in the news. And from all around the world, that started to change. We've been starving countries, though, for a long time. You know, China didn't cut itself off from us. We cut ourselves off from China. We're the ones that said that there couldn't be any trade. We cut ourselves off from Vietnam. Vietnam didn't cut themselves off from us. We cut off Cuba. And still have got it cut off, and still are trying to starve that country. I think the U.S. movement should be speaking more about the embargo and the things that are going on in Iraq. But quite frankly, we're so weak and small at this point and uncoordinated that the kind of force that we could put on the government, even in the 80s, we don't have right now. And that's our fault. I mean, those of us in the movement did not keep organizations alive. On the other hand, maybe this generation is better off developing their own forms of organization and not basing themselves off the past. That doesn't mean that I don't want you to listen to me and I can tell you every fucking thing I did wrong for the last 30 years. But it does mean that I think maybe you may develop stuff that has a more lasting effect that grows out of the American environment, not necessarily out of some other country. We didn't even make our first banner, by the way. I'm going all over the place. Vietnam Vets Against the War. A bunch of vets showed up at an office, asked if they could come to the demonstration the next day. And they said yes, the Peace People, Fifth Avenue Peace Parade Committee, almost all Jewish. And they sat down after the vets left, and they said, do you really think those guys are going to come? And they said, why not? And so they stayed up all night making a banner that said Vietnam Vets Against the War. That's how we got our name, and that's how we got our banner.
I have a bit of a more personal question, so please feel free to reject it. It's I would like to know if you had personal experience with the PTSD syndromes in the aftermath of war.
Sure. I was crazy as a loon. Still am. Biggest problem was control of temper, which I still haven't done, but which, as I get older, becomes easier. I thought that if I just did political work, that I could overcome it. And so I just did political work. And I felt good about it. But I think one day in the early 1980s, 1 week I stopped sleeping. And I went to a friend who was an emergency room doctor, and I said, give me some drugs. I'm not sleeping. And he gave me some drugs, and he said, they'll make you sleep and you'll dream. But if you take too many, they'll kill you. And if you take a little bit but not too many, you'll probably end up with it's a brain thing, epilepsy. And he said, so I'm going to trust you. And I wasn't about to kill myself because I had a 2-year-old daughter. And then I went to the doctor afterwards, and I took these drugs, and I slept for a week. I just got up to piss. So I stayed for a week, slept for a week. Went to my doctor. I said, I think it's Agent Orange. And my personal physician doctor said, no. I'll send you for all the tests. You've got to see a shrink. And the VA at that time had a program where if you could prove that you didn't trust the Veterans Administration, one thing Good Carter did, you could get a private psychiatrist not connected with the federal government. So I went to the VA guy, counselor, and they said, well, sure, of course you're paranoid. So I got a real expensive Lakeview social worker. And for 2 years, 2 times a week, I went for therapy, and then another 6 months once a week. And he did all that stuff that modern people do, the little things under your fingernails so you can know when you're tense and when your blood's high and when it's low. And I could tell him, but that's okay. And he taught me several things to do to control my temper, and he taught me several things which are actually Zen to sleep without using drugs, which I use occasionally, not enough. And I learned to do things, two things. I learned to do things to slow down so I didn't go to the absolute highest levels of anger. I was a lot like the Big Lebowski. Did you see that?
Yes.
Okay. You know the guy, John Goodman? Me and all my friends are like that. I don't care what happens, it always ends up being back to Vietnam. And that's because Vietnam is always there in such a big way. And I learned that everything wasn't always back to Vietnam. And the other thing was I would have giant anxiety attacks. I still have them. And I would have this fear that since I'd killed people, that I might do it again. And I was afraid of losing control. Control to me was everything. And so one of the good side things about Vietnam vets getting PTSD recognized was that it also opened it up to be recognized for women in rape. Not that eventually the psychiatric academy wouldn't have done that, but once they said that things like this exist, once they were able to do it for Vietnam vets, then it opened it up for a whole lot of other things in terms of what goes on and what people suffer from and why they suffer from it.
When you were a platoon leader and you had, you said a certain amount of men underneath you, like 18 to 45, did you ever experience any kind of problem with some of the men in your platoon, any like conflicts, like any racial problems, fights, anything like that?
We were in the jungle, and most racial problems occurred in the rear area. I know that there was also like racial problems in armored units, but we were an infantry unit. I mean, you're out there with 24 guys, and you're in a squad of 8 people. You depend on them. You become best friends. I mean, I didn't see racial conflicts there. In the rear area was another question. There was a lot of racial conflicts, but I didn't see it where I was. Also, a big turning point, of course, was the murder of Martin Luther King in terms of attitudes and stuff like that. There was racial whatevers. I did hear racial epithets and stuff like that, but I didn't see racial problems between guys. Guys would die for each other.
I've been asked, you talk about some of the racism in training. Were you ever perceived as not white? Not as
I had to tell people. And then it's interesting because the white people wanted me to be Italian, and I was white, and I was young, and so they would just pretend. And then I have Mexicans that were totally comfortable with me, and then I had black friends who were glad I was Mexican because they didn't want to like me if I was white. And I don't blame them. I was an officer, goddammit. Fuck, I wasn't. Yeah, I saw a lot of that. It's strange being a real Caucasian Mexican American. Wait, if some other people know will come back. Is there any?
I'm wondering about, I just saw an article that said there are like 600 babies born to Gulf War veterans in Mississippi, and out of them like 2/3 have severe or congenital birth defects due to chemical and biological weapons in Iraq. And I'm wondering, based on issues like that, is there a similar response to veterans who were in that war compared to veterans in the Vietnam War when they started learning about things like that?
I think there is, but there's a whole bunch of different things. One is the number of people affected. Two is the fact of how short the war was, how the war was put together, how the GIs were torn apart afterwards. You don't have people going in and out like with Vietnam with 10 years. You don't have the same numbers of people. They obviously got a much more raw deal in terms of being poisoned. I don't think it has anything to do with what the Iraqis did. I think we poisoned our own troops. I think in the combinations of the experimental drugs that we forced them to take and the fact that we used depleted uranium rounds. That meant that the GIs were in a short area constantly with heat, and the exposure to that would have been, we don't even know yet, because that's the first time they've gone through the concentrated things. GIs have been around them, but not in a constant firing like was going on in the Persian Gulf War. Also, people who are in decontamination areas were doing that 12 and 13 hours a day, and they were out in the hot sun, in enclosed areas, tent-shielded areas. And so if there was any kind of contamination, they obviously were going to be connected with it. And they're going to talk about Saddam Hussein poisoning our GIs until the last Persian Gulf vet dies of Persian Gulf syndrome. They still don't talk about atomic vets. I mean, look at all the people we poisoned. I mean, the Russians didn't kill American GIs with atomic weapons. We killed American GIs with atomic weapons.
I was in Desert Storm in the Navy, and I wasn't here to hear much of the propaganda or whatever that was in the United States. I was wondering if the VVAW took a stand against the Iraq War, and if so, how was that? Your opinion on the experience, since the majority of the country seemed to have, we support our troops, the yellow ribbons, and things like that.
We had no problems. First off, you got to remember that Saddam Hussein was supported by the United States government. Big. Billions and billions of dollars. If you were there, you know. I mean, during the Iraq-Iran war, we shot down an Iranian 747. That was part of containment of Iran. I mean, we were already demonstrating for the Kurds having democratic rights, and we were all also demonstrating against our support for Iraq prior to the thing going on. When he invaded Kuwait, we already hated it, but we didn't see that war was the answer to that problem. The question of an embargo, the question of negotiations hadn't even been started. The question of whether they pulled out. They didn't give Saddam Hussein 10 years to see what he was going to do. They started in bombing, and the kind of bombings that they did, a lot of it was not directed towards the military industrial complex. It was directed towards the civilian infrastructure in a real way. And by that I mean the water and the sanitation system. That's civilian. And again, compare what we did in Iraq to what we're doing in the Persian Gulf. The first demonstration in Chicago, which we called No Blood for Oil, and we didn't want a war in the Persian Gulf area, we had 120, 150 people. Half of them were Palestinian and Arab and Middle East people, and the other half were Vietnam vets, and the other quarter, and the other half were anti-war activists. And we held it at the Standard Oil building, and we said this war is a war for oil. They don't care about lives, never have, never will. In December, we had another demonstration. We were up to 5,000 people. On the day that the war started, we had 17,000 people in the streets of Chicago. And so there was a support for the war, and there was a yellow ribbon thing, but everybody who was tying a yellow ribbon wasn't pro-war. They were saying, we don't want the vets and the GIs to be forgotten, and so sometimes it overran. The other thing is that the support, from what I could see, was extremely shallow. It wasn't deep-seated like when I went to Vietnam. This was based upon the fact that they weren't going to have heavy casualties, and the war was going to end very quickly. I couldn't believe it when Bush stopped. I thought he was going to go for Baghdad, and if he had, it'd have been like Korea or it'd have been like Vietnam, and people would have been in the streets. Because once we had never fought the Republican Guard. The people that we smashed in Kuwait were draftee divisions. We have members in this area who were in the Marine recon units that took the Kuwaiti airport. They all ran away. There was a big write-up in the Marine Corps Gazette about this giant battle, and he laughs. He was in the first armored vehicle that was there. There was 3 people left. One a person that wanted to defect, one a guy that they had left behind and made him promise that he would call and tell them when they got there so that they could run away faster, and another guy who fell asleep and didn't know that the Americans had arrived. He said there wasn't a bullet fired, and that was supposedly a gigantic battle. And when he took his first prisoners, he told us, he said that he wanted to kill them because he had friends that were shot, he'd had friends killed in friendly fire, and he saw all these people surrendering, and he's going, oh yeah, now you're going to surrender. And after he accepted the surrender, he felt real guilty. And he said, why? Because all of them were draftees, all of them hated Saddam Hussein. The officer in charge had only been given 2 weeks of training. He'd been drafted walking down the street. He was a University of Baghdad student. And what Hussein did was put divisions of troops that he considered worthless, in between him and the Republican Guard, and that's who we killed. It's a Soviet Stalin tactic from the Second World War. You put your labor battalions up front, you let them get smashed first, they slow down the thing, and that's exactly where he got those tactics from. The Republican Guard are still around. That's how come he's still around. We never took him. This is another question. And you should stop and talk to VVA. You should join us. We have members that are Persian Gulf vets. We got everything from World War II, although sometimes we feel like we're Civil War vets, all the way up to Vietnam, all the way up to Panama, to Grenada, to Lebanon, and the Persian Gulf.
Actually, I was wondering what your view of the VFW was.
Some people in the VFW are real nice. The leadership is shit. And we feed homeless vets every year, and twice a year in Chicago. And we're able to get all of the veterans groups together, regardless of what our politics are. You know, American Legion and VetNow and VVA and VVAW. And the VFW is the one group that wouldn't work in conjunction with other groups. Hopefully that'll change.
Was AMVETS involved?
There's no, AMVETS is so tiny, teeny tiny. And most of the American Legion guys, except for a few young ones, are really mostly World War II vets.
Here.
You pick people. I'm so busy looking at one.
I'm your eyes.
Cool.
So from what you saw, what do you think is the reason that we fought Vietnam, that the government chose to fight? Do you think they truly believe in the domino theory, or do you think it was more economic?
I think it was everything. See, I think it was everything. It was different things at different times. When part of it was domino theory, and I think they believed it. Part of it was economic, was rice basket of Asia. But you also have to remember that when they say it was the rice basket of Asia, that meant that they took food out and didn't let the Vietnamese eat. It was like when Britain was taking food out of Ireland during the famine. There was food there, but the British just took it out for other people to eat. It was the same way under the French. They had terrible famines, and the French plantation owners were making money. But anyway, it grew a lot of rice. There was the question of rubber. They did discover that there was oil off the coast. I actually think the main reason they fought it was because of a line by Marlon Brando out of Bern. And if you all don't run out and see this movie, I'll give you an F. But in this story of Marlon Brando as a British captain fighting a slave insurrection in a Caribbean island, he's burning the island to the ground, and all these plantation owners are pissed. And this silly little goof British officer, obviously someone who's probably supervisor to my mother family in Britain, goes, you can't do this, you're destroying the island. You got to stop all of this. What are you doing? You're destroying everything. And Marlon Brando slaps him and says, you fool. This war isn't about this island. The war is about the 100 other islands. And if this place gets its freedom, then that goes on the wind. It's not about winning this island. It's about the other 99. So you can destroy this place because you want to send a message to all the rest of the slaves that if they rebel, that they'll be slapped down. And that is the most reason that we were there. When we first went to Vietnam, the symbol, and you better take a newspaper, was, I'm not going to go on because I've been talking forever, but they have the Great Wall of China. That's was the first Vietnam patch is actually on that. Great Wall of China, 3,000 miles away from Vietnam, and the Vietnamese have only fought the Chinese for like 1,800 years out of the last 2,000. But we're going to war because we've got to block the Great Wall of China. We went to war because the Vietnamese were puppets of the Chinese. Richard Nixon, in order to try to win the Vietnam War, went to China and kissed Mao Zedong's butt. Tail wagging the dog? Why were we there? What was it at any given point in history? Sometimes it was domino theory, sometimes it was money. Biggest reason we were there was we were telling colonial people, don't the fuck stand up or we slap you down. If there's a slave revolt in the United States, why'd they hang them all? They were sending a message to every other slave, don't. And what happened when Vietnam won? Around the world, people got their freedom. Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique. Around the world, people said, you can fight, you can be independent. There was a domino theory, but it wasn't in Southeast Asia. It was colonies around the world that said that they had the right to stand up and have their own kind of government.
Gary, got about, it's almost 9. Did you want to say anything more about political activism or
Of course.
final words? That's why I figured
The only
I'd break
reason
in
I
now.
really,
Otherwise we'll go until midnight.
the only reason I really come. Like you live in a country where you don't get killed for being a political activist. There are some people like Malcolm X. I don't think there's a Malcolm X in here that might. Some people like King. But for the most part, you're able to stand up and engage in political activity and get away with it. Sometimes someone will spit on you. Maybe you won't get a job you want in the DA's office. Or maybe the local newspaper won't hire you after they discover you can think. But for the most part, you can be engaged in political activity and not have to be arrested, not have to go to jail, not have to worry about your parents being detained or killed. It is a responsibility as Americans for you to be politically involved. We got all the fucking money in the world, we have all the health, we have all the democracy, and we have all the responsibility that comes with that. We have a responsibility to fight for social justice. If you can drink a 6-pack a week, which I do, you can donate a couple of bucks. If you watch South Park, which I do over and over again, you can get out with the anti-chief people and say it's wrong to have a mascot that's a Native American, that's a human. You have a responsibility to be politically active. And right now, while you're in school, you got the best time to do it. You got free time, you go to classes, you get to read books, you get to fucking have ideas, you get to exchange those ideas, you get to develop your thoughts. It ain't about getting A's, it's about learning how to think. It's about how developing to the point where you're in control of your own life. I always like to tell the story of the value of political activism, and it's trite, but so what? Because it's my favorite story. John D. Rockefeller, the motherfucker, slaughterer of minors, killer of babies, richest person in the universe, went through his life being a shit and an asshole that he was, and accumulating fame and fortune and power. And when he's an old man and was 90 years old, he was so afraid of death that he had 2 Afro-American wet nurses, and he suckled like a baby so he could hang on to life. His money couldn't be taken with him. He couldn't die like an adult. Wet nursed in his 90s because he's afraid to die. And there's Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks lives in the ghetto. Rosa Parks has no money. Rosa Parks refused to move on a bus and ignited a fire that led to the Civil Rights Revolution. Rosa Parks got beat on her front porch by a thug. Rosa Parks still lives in the ghetto. Rosa Parks went to the Million Man March. And when she stood up on the stage with Farrakhan, she talked about her love of the Jewish people. She talked about women's rights. She talked about Afro-Americans. She talked about unity of the left. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of Alabama. She wasn't going to be afraid of Farrakhan. Because Rosa Parks lives in the ghetto. She sits on her front porch and she gets to listen and think back on a life that was engaged in social justice and the fact that she changed the world. Be 93 and be like that motherfucker John D. Rockefeller. Be 90 and be like Rosa Parks. What do you want to be? If you want to be John D. Rockefeller, I can't do nothing about that. Right here, you've got a lot of political activists in the room. You've got people that are putting their lives on the line, going out to things like that scared the shit out of me, like the tail parties at the football games. You got movements that are going on. I'm not going to tell you what to get involved with. You know what you have to get involved with, but you know you have to get involved. That's all.
Thank you all for coming by, and if any of you are going to be around like next year, you're probably going to have many chances to hear Barry talk again. So he comes down here at least once every semester to drink 6-packs.
Cases.
You're welcome to stop by the table here, pick up copies of the VVAW paper. Don't pay attention to the 50-cent price on it. We don't, so just go ahead and pick those up. There's some flyers about some upcoming events in the next couple of weeks. Actually, there's a benefit to the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, a rock show taking place tomorrow night. There's little green flyers there about that. If you're into local rock music, pick that up. And thanks again. Okay.